MAYI Diesel generator MEP-802A water pump replacement. Has been leaking for some time based on the white residue behind the fan, as well as residue from the weep hole of the water pump. Appropriate parts for replacement: Lester Petter water pump 751-41022, which also comes with gaskets for the thermostat and the water pump housing. Replacement thermostat is the MEPI MU55358. Replacement belt is the Gates K040355. There are approximately 7 bolts that bolt into the front of the water pump as it bolts to the engine. One of the ports to note is the temperature sensor in the middle, as well as the top radiator hose and the bottom radiator hose, in addition to several bolt plugs. Important to note, this is a generator with over 17,500 hours on it. If there's other maintenance to be done, such as the fuel filter or the air filter, now is the time to do that as well. We will begin by removing all the bolts from the top shroud. A 5/16 should work fine on most of these bolts. All these bolts should be removed in order to work around the water pump a bit easier. Be careful as you remove the top bolts that are approximately 5/16. The bottom bolts themselves may end up being 3/8 inch and also have to be held. Be careful not to lose any bolts inside the housing. There are approximately 9 bolts on the rear side of the shroud. These bolts go directly into the shroud itself. They do not have nuts on the other side in which you need to hold, nor do you have access to. There are several bolts on the top that are exactly the same. 5 bolts there. Of course, other bolts that hold the shroud on here, as well as holding the shroud on here. And then, of course, the bolts up at the top. Once all these bolts are removed, you should have an easier time removing the actual shroud. As prep work, it's also helpful to have extra bolts, washers, crush washers, and nuts available. As you pull off the top part of the generator housing, be careful of the gasket from the exhaust. Do not lose it. In addition, it's helpful to stuff something into the exhaust, preferably a shop towel, to avoid any unnecessary debris or nuts or bolts falling in. To continue to remove the scoop at the top, you may continue on the outside with 5/16 bolts, and on the inside with 3/8 inch bolts in order to remove the air scoop. With the top part of the air scoop removed, we have a better access to the shroud around the radiator fan. Be careful to note, these are 3/8 inch bolts with washers and crush washers. It's a good idea to go ahead and replace these crush washers if you have them available. For the radiator fan shroud, there are approximately 8 bolts with nuts and washers. They are 5/16 bolts. Be careful not to lose the washers. Approximately 4 on the top and 4 on the bottom to release the radiator fan shroud. Once the 5 bolts have been removed, the radiator fan shroud comes off in 2 pieces. The piece to the right, as you stand in front of the generator, comes off a little bit easier as you do not have to remove hoses. This will allow access to the fan nut on the front of the water pump, as well as clear access to all of the clamps for the hoses. You will have to remove at least 1 hose in order to get the fan shroud off from the other side. With the fan shroud removed, you have clear access to the fan nut. Yes, I had to remove the upper and lower radiator hoses, and it'd be helpful to have a large bin or flexible bin in order to catch the wealth of coolant that'll express from the water pump. This also, of course, exposes the temperature sensor, a thermostat housing, and of course you have full access to the alternator and belt as well. As we have full access to the cooling fan nut on the end of the water pump, it is important to note that it is a large nut. If you do not have at least a crescent wrench larger than 12-inch, it will not fit. You may have to use a pipe wrench. You also need to make sure you have leverage to make sure the fan does not spin. You do, in fact, unthread or loosen the bolt by going clockwise. Repeat, clockwise, unlike most conventional bolts where you loosen it going counterclockwise. In this case, pushing it forward by leaving leverage on it will loosen the bolt. Be gentle with it. Do not strip the bolt. Be sure that you're going the right direction. If there's any doubt, stop, check again. The loose nut loosens up the fan. Beware that there's a nut and a washer to be aware of and to keep track of. Once this has been loosened, you can remove the nut, remove the washer, and remove the fan for easier removal of the water pump. It is time to loosen the belt. In order to loosen the belt from the alternator side, there is a nut at the bottom of the alternator, approximately 3/4 inch wrench should do it. That will loosen the pivot point. The swing arm will be loosened then by a 1/2 inch nut on the side of the alternator. It's important to note that if batteries are still hooked up, please remove or disconnect the batteries to avoid shorting out your alternator. That is an expensive repair. The belt has been removed. The belt itself does not look to be in horrible condition. There are a couple of threads on the outside, but it can be kept for maybe a spare belt. But it is a Gates belt, so generally you have the ability to replace them at your local parts store relatively easily. You may remove the swing arm from the alternator or remove the alternator altogether to make it easier to access the water pump and the water pump seal. I'm currently doing this with a 1/2 inch ratchet on the 7 bolts around the water pump. The water pump bolts are loosened. All 5 bolts along the top and beside the thermostat, and of course 2 nuts that happen to be under the water pump itself. All of the bolts are now loosened. The only thing left is to take out the temperature sensor and the wire. Then I can pry the water pump away from the engine. The water pump and the adapter plate has been removed. The water pump, as you can see here, has been out. It actually is connected to an adapter plate. This is where the gasket for the water pump will go, is to the adapter plate. The adapter plate itself has its own gasket and O-ring. This O-ring can be replaced by any particular O-ring from O'Reilly's or auto parts store. The gasket, on the other hand, I could not find. As a result, I ended up with a rubber cellulose sheet gasket or blue RTV. Note, blue RTV takes 24 hours to cure, so if you have that much time, it's a better seal from what I understand. If you don't have that much time, using a rubber cellulose sheet to cut out to this particular design for this gasket is going to be a better option. As we start to transfer the different pieces of the water pumps over, as you can see, I've started transferring the sensors over from the old water pump to the new water pump. The smaller sensor, of course, will be a 1/2 inch, just like the rest of the nuts. The larger sensor, not quite sure. I had to use a crescent wrench for that one. We also have to move over the thermostat housing. of which I did get a replacement thermostat and thermostat gasket for the new water pump. In the final stages of transferring all of the equipment off of the old water pump to the new water pump, I chose to examine the old thermostat, and it seems that the old thermostat has a opening temperature of 88 degrees Celsius, where the new thermostat, the MAYI MEP-802A, has an opening temperature of 82 degrees Celsius. If you would like to find one that's more OEM, I'm sure that you can find some online, possibly from Green Mountain Generators, or you can probably just find a MAYI that happens to be 88 degrees Celsius. Just before transferring it, I had to transfer the housing here. As I transfer the housing, I also want to make sure that I clean out the old gasket before putting the new thermostat and new thermostat gasket that came with the water pump onto the new water pump. Now, with the thermostat in appropriately and the thermostat housing appropriately cleaned, I can put the thermostat in, put the housing on, and tighten it down with the bolts that came out of the original water pump. This will be the first step into putting everything back together. Going back to the adapter plate, this is the engine side of the adapter plate. As you can see, I've put a new O-ring on the adapter plate. This can be picked up at any parts store. This is what I believe was actually doing the most leaking of coolant while the generator was in operation. As I mentioned earlier, there is not a gasket that came with my kit for the engine side of the adapter plate. So with the cellulose paper, we're able to draw out and trace a gasket that fits directly onto this side. I'm in the process of drawing out another gasket that gives us a little extra protection around the actual inlet pipe. Now, the gaskets for the water pump that came in the kit are ready to be applied. The thermostat housing, the old thermostat housing, is now on with a thermostat gasket covering the new thermostat at 82 degrees Celsius. And new gaskets for the adapter plate have been crafted out of cellulose and are ready to be put on. So first will be this, the adapter plate, and second will be the water pump, and these bolts will hold them all on. Installation of the water pump and the lower temperature thermostat, it does not appear to be going above 180 degrees per the 82 degrees Celsius new thermostat.